Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you're here. Tonight, we will continue our reading of Marcus Garvey and the Vision of Africa, Part 2, The Years of Triumph and Tragedy, 1920 through 1925. Tonight's commentary is by John Henrik Clark.
Greetings. My name is the Revolutionary Matron, and my show is called The Learning Curve. I broadcast on a network called KWAZ Radio. There are other hosts on the network I'd like you to meet.
Greetings, everyone. This is Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast, inviting you to tune in to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the Pro-Black Perspective, where Black problems are addressed with Black solutions.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed here belong solely to the respondent, and they do not necessarily reflect any broadcast networks, affiliates, nor sponsors. The Learning Curve is a broadcast created for the benefit of my global community. Black is a consciousness. Content is being used for our commentary, research, criticism, education, scholarship, teaching, preaching, and news reporting. No copyright infringement is intended. I will make enunciation mistakes. I will give you my opinion about the information. And if you ever ask, I will send you my source.
The Years of Triumph and Tragedy, 1920 to 1925. Commentary by John Henrik Clark. After the historic first UNIA International Convention of the Negro Peoples of the World at Madison Square Garden in 1920, the cry, Africa for the Africans, those at home and those abroad, became part of the folklore of Black Americans. The most important document that came out of this convention was the Declaration of the Rights of the Negro Peoples of the World. Marcus Garvey had started negotiations with the president of Liberia for colonization and development of Africa by Western world Blacks. This was the beginning of the hope and heartbreak of Marcus Garvey's colonization scheme. Between 1920 and 1925, the Garvey movement rose to great heights and, in spite of its troubles, continued to grow. This is the period in which the movement had its greatest success and was under the severest criticism. The Convention of 1920 was a monumental achievement in Black organizations. This convention came in the years after the First World War, and when the promises to Black Americans had been broken, lynching was rampant, and when Blacks were still recovering from the Red Summer of 1919, in which there were race riots in most of the major cities, and the white unemployed took out their grievances on the Blacks, who many times were competing with them for the few available jobs. During this time, Garvey brought the Black Star Line into being and into a multiplicity of troubles. He divorced his wife and married another and made a name and his organization household words for nearly every part of the world where Black people live. The trials and tribulations of the Black Star Line would read like the libretto of a comic opera, except that the events were both hectic and tragic. There were more villains than heroes involved in this attempt to restore to Black people a sense of worth and nationness. Greetings, Oni from the Pro Black Perspective and Brother Bakari. I'm so glad you're here. This is Dr. John Henrik Clark speaking. Marcus Garvey's trouble with the courts started soon after the formation of the Black Star Line. The charges and countercharges relating to the Black Star Line were the basis of most of his troubles and the cause of his conviction and sentencing to Atlanta prison. This was the beginning of the end of the greatest years of the Garvey movement. The years of triumph and tragedy were building years, searching years, and years of magnificent dreaming. Greetings, Moana Haguziki and Sister Ra. I'm so glad you're here. Marcus Garvey's vision of Africa had lifted the spirit of Black Americans out of the depression that followed the First World War, and the UNIA's African legions and Black Cross nurses became familiar sights in the streets of Harlem. The UNIA grew in membership and support of all kinds. Garvey was the beating heart of the movement. His persuasive voice and prolific writings and his effective use of pageantry struck a responsive chord throughout the Black communities of America and abroad. Branches of the movement were established in Latin America, wherever there were large Caribbean communities. An African Orthodox church was founded in America. Now the Black man was searching for a new God as well as a new land. The Garvey movement began to take effective roots in America when millions of Blacks had begun to feel they would never know full citizenship with dignity in this country, where their ancestors had been brought against their will, and where they had contributed to the wealth and development of the country in spite of conditions of previous servitude. Against this background of broken promises and fading hope, Marcus Garvey began to build a worldwide Black movement. This, the first Black mass protest crusade in the history of the United States, began to pose serious problems for white America. This movement also posed serious problems for the then existing Black leadership, especially for W.E.B. Du Bois. In the article, Du Bois versus Garvey, Race Propagandists at War, Elliot M. Rudnick outlines the origins of the conflict between these two Black giants who looked at the world from different vantage points. Both of them were Pan-Africans, and both of them had their objectives, the freedom and redemption of African people everywhere. Yet there was no meeting of the minds as to the methods of reaching these desirable goals. The two men were not strangers to each other before Garvey came to the United States in 1916. Du Bois had heard of Garvey when he vacationed in Jamaica in 1915. He had been very well received by both white and colored people, and Garvey and his associates had joined in on the welcome. After this brief first meeting, Garvey and Du Bois went their separate ways, organizationally and ideologically. Garvey had been accused of, quote unquote, introducing the Jamaican Black mulatto schism to the United States, where Du Bois claimed it had no relevance and only bred disunity. While the color situation in the United States differed appreciably from that in Jamaica, both situations were serious and tragic. In my opinion, both Du Bois and Garvey erred in the way they handled this matter in the way that they handled each other. Du Bois often addressed advice to Garvey as if the president of the UNIA were a misguided child, and Garvey spoke of Du Bois as if he were a fraud and a traitor to his people. At a critical period, this kind of conduct was a negation of the cause that had been the life work of both men. Garvey's reaction to the Pan-African Congress of 1919 had not been positive. He accused Du Bois of sabotaging his work abroad, especially in Liberia. Du Bois was pictured as a fallen old warrior who had already seen his best days. The editorial writers on Garvey's newspaper Negro World joined A. Philip Randolph's Messenger magazine in saying that W.E.B. Du Bois was controlled by the white capitalists on the NAACP's board of directors. Besides, Garvey thought that Du Bois was being given too much credit as the founder of Pan-Africanism. Criticism notwithstanding, Du Bois began the preparation for the Second Pan-African Congress during the early part of 1921. He stated that his intention was to invite not only Negro governments, but all Negro organizations interested in the people of African descent. Du Bois was carefully pointing out the difference between the Pan-African Congress and the Garvey movement. The NAACP printed a letter from the president of Liberia to the effect that his country would not be used as a base from which the Garvey movement could harass other governments in Africa. Now the issue was joined and the lines were drawn. After this date, peace between Marcus Garvey and W.E.B. Du Bois seems to have been an impossibility. The Second Pan-African Congress was held while cross-currents of accusations were passing between Du Bois and Garvey. In the booklet, History of the Pan-African Congress, Du Bois describes how the Congress started. The idea of Pan-Africa having been established, we attempted to build a real organization. We went to work first to assemble a more authentic Pan-African Congress and movement. We corresponded with Negroes in all parts of Africa and in other parts of the world, and finally arranged for a Congress to meet in London, Brussels, and Paris in August and September of 1921. Of the 113 delegates to this Congress, 41 were from Africa, 35 from the United States, 24 represented Negroes living in Europe, and 7 were from the West Indies. Thus, the African element showed growth. They came for the most part, but not in all cases, as individuals and more seldom as the representatives of organizations or groups. This is Du Bois speaking about the Congress. The Pan-African movement thus began to represent a growth and development, but it immediately ran into difficulties. First of all, there was the natural reaction of war and the determination on the part of certain elements in England, Belgium, and elsewhere to recoup their war losses by intensified exploitation of the colonies. They were suspicious of native movements of any sort. Then, too, there came simultaneously another movement stemming from the West Indies, which accounted for our small West Indian representation. He's talking about Garvey. This was in its way a people's movement rather than a movement of the intellectuals. It was led by Marcus Garvey, and it presented a poorly conceived but intensely earnest determination to unite the Negroes of the world, more especially in commercial enterprise. It used all the nationalist and racial paraphernalia of popular agitation, and its strength lay in its backing by the masses of West Indians and by increasing numbers of American Negroes. Its weaknesses lay in its demagogic leadership, its intemperate propaganda, and the natural fear which it threw into the colonial powers. Speaking even more bluntly, Du Bois says in his book, Dusk of Dawn, the Pan African movement ran into two fatal difficulties. First of all, it was much too early to assume, as I had assumed, that in 1921 the war was over. In fact, the whole tremendous drama which followed the war, political and social revolution, economic upheaval and depression, national and racial hatred, all these things made a setting in which any such movement I had envisaged, probably at the time, impossible. I sensed this in the bitter and deep opposition which our resolutions invoked in Belgium. Both the Belgian and French governments were aroused and disturbed, and the English opposition hovered in the background. There came, too, a second difficulty which had elements of comedy and curious social frustration, but nevertheless was real and a sense of tragic. Marcus Garvey walked into the scene. Bwana Haguziki says Du Bois was on that talented 10th and elitist black crap. And you're absolutely right. In 1921, Marcus Garvey made a tour of Central America, Cuba, and Jamaica. He was encouraged by the growth of the Garvey movement and the acceptance of his teachings throughout the Caribbean islands. His main objective was to boost the sales of the Black Star Line stock. He achieved this while trouble was developing with the ships of the Black Star Line and the crews. After this tour, Marcus Garvey was prevented from re-entering the United States for a while. In the face of other troubles brewing in Jamaica in 1921, Garvey sent a letter to the Daily Gleaner that antagonized the ruling elite on the island, both black and white. Garvey's letter read in part, Jamaica, as I see it, is controlled by a few inexperienced, imported strangers, whose position in Jamaica as officials and heads of departments has come to them as godsends. Shh. These fellows know well that they could find no place in the body politic of their own native lands because of their inferiority and their inability to perform technical work. Yet, through the system of any white man being better than a native, these imported gentlemen are continuously being sent out to the colonies or dumping grounds to administer the affairs of our governments. It is time that a halt be called. If Jamaica is to be saved, if Jamaica is to take her place among the progressive nations of the world, then we must have a change of policy. Jamaica is void of that national spirit that should characterize every country. Everybody in Jamaica seems to be looking to the mother country for. I feel that Jamaica wants a political awakening, and it should come from within and not from without. We feel that we are quite competent to handle the affairs of our country, and now all that we ask is a chance. Jamaicans, as I can see, worship too much that which comes from abroad and from anywhere. If a thing, a man, or an animal is imported, it is supposed to be better than the native product. How silly. As for individuals, I have seen some of the greatest idiots abroad. I would recommend that the poorer classes of Jamaica, the working classes, get together and form themselves into unions and organizations and elect their members for the Legislative Council. With few exceptions, the men in the council represent themselves and their class. When Garvey was eventually given permission to return to the United States, he began immediately to prepare for the second UNIA convention in 1921. The second convention was not as impressive as the first one held the previous year. Rumors about the mismanagement of the Black Star Line were rampant, and no one was putting these rumors to rest. It was discovered that some of the funds of the Black Star Line had been deposited in the personal bank accounts of some of the officials. In January of 1922, Garvey and three of the main officials of the line were arrested and indicted for using the mail to defraud. They were released on bail as the investigation of the Black Star Line continued. The third convention of the UNIA was held in August of 1922, but was not as well attended as the previous ones. Some of Garvey's enemies organized anti-Garvey rallies and literally started a Garvey must go movement. There was some indication that the worldwide influence of the Garvey movement while the third convention was being held. For a number of years, the British Secret Service had been keeping a record of Garvey's activities and making efforts to halt the spread of Garvey's ideas in the colonies. There is some indication that the French were engaged in similar surveillance. Also, in 1922, Marcus Garvey had to talk with the members of the Ku Klux Klan that was seriously misinterpreted. The Imperial Wizard had expressed a desire to see and talk to Garvey. He was head of the largest organization of whites then existing in the country. Marcus Garvey was his Black counterpart. The meeting did not result in an alliance and was probably ill-advised, mainly because of the misinterpretation that has been put upon it through the years. In September of 1923, the reported failure of the Black Star Line and allegations of financial fraud in the UNIA led Dubose to write Garvey off as a failure. Exactly 1 year later, while Garvey was awaiting bail in the Tombs, the government of Liberia honored W.E.B. Du Bois by inviting him to the inauguration of President Charles D. King. In the meantime, Marcus Garvey and the officials of the Black Star Line were being brought to trial in New York City. The following account of the trial was prepared by Amy Jacques Garvey, and she writes, after the indictment of the officers of the Black Star Line, the federal district attorney sent 2 trucks up to the offices of the Black Star Line, the local branch of the UNIA and the Negro World, which were housed in 3 different buildings and which functioned independently. They took away files, books, records, etc. Garvey tried to stop them, as only the Black Star Line books and etc. should have been taken in order to get evidence in the case. But he was told that he would be cited for contempt if he dared to prevent them from getting everything connected to Garvey. This was intended to halt the work of the organization, but the members and even outsiders realized that Garvey was being persecuted, not prosecuted, so the membership increased. The Black Star Line was incorporated under the laws of the state of Delaware. The 4 indicted officers were Marcus Garvey, president, Orlando Thompson, vice president, George Tobias, treasurer, and Ellie Garcia, secretary. They were released on bail of $2,500 each until the day of trial, which started May 21st of 1923 in federal court, New York City. Each defendant had an attorney. Judge Julian Mack presided with a white jury. At the start of the trial, Garvey, through his attorney, made application that the trial judge declare himself disqualified to try the case on the ground that he was a member or contributor to the NAACP, an association whose officers were actively opposed to Garvey and his movement. Judge Mack admitted his connection with the NAACP but denied bias. The motion was denied, and the same judge proceeded to try the case. At the end of the second day of trial, Garvey's attorney came to our flat and he said he was acting on the advice and in Garvey's interests. As his lawyer, he was advising him to plead guilty to the technical charge. He had reasons to believe that he would be fined and admonished for future activities. Garvey was surprised at his suggestion and told him that he did not seem to understand what was behind the prosecution. After a lengthy argument on the matter, which brought out other facts, Garvey felt that his attorney was being used innocently to trap him and asked him to withdraw from his court defense. In leaving, the attorney warned, "It will go hard with you." Garvey retorted, "I will prove to the jury that I am not guilty of any fraud." Party politics plays an important part in the judiciary, as judges are elected on their selection by politicians. Garvey tried to get another attorney whose politics were Republican, as the judge and the district attorney were Republicans, but he failed, as some were warned not to handle the Garvey defense. The trial lasted about 4 weeks, during which time the district attorney's henchmen circulated rumors that Garveyites were armed so as to justify the indignity of searching them daily. The climax came when it was alleged that an anonymous letter was received at the district attorney's office stating that one of Garvey's men was going to get the judge. The letter was released to the press with the consequent exaggerated headlines. Bomb squad men and the Secret Service cordoned off the courtroom. The attitude of the prosecutor is summed up in his final plea to the jury. "Gentlemen, will you let the tiger loose?" It was clear he was not prosecuting the officers of the Black Star Line, only Garvey. So the other 3 officers were acquitted and Garvey found guilty on one count, to wit, that on or about December 13th, 1920, for the purpose of executing the scheme and artifice, Garvey placed in a post office of the Southern District of New York a certain letter or circular enclosed in a postage-paid envelope, addressed to Benny Dancy, number 34 West 131st Street, New York City. An empty envelope was put in evidence, and the prosecutor assumed that it was either a letter or a circular was enclosed in it, inducing Dancy to buy shares. Anyone could have rubber stamped the return address of the Black Star Line on that envelope, and Garvey never took letters to the post office. Nor was there any evidence that this envelope came from the president's office. W.A. Domingo sent a telegram to Prosecutor Maddox. "Congratulations on bagging the tiger." When Garvey read about it, he commented, "There are millions of cubs loose all over the world who are determined to fight their way out of any corral." The judge said he would not pass sentence for a few days. The prosecutor immediately asked that Garvey be held in custody without bail. He made the startling statement that Garvey had arms and ammunitions in Liberty Hall and that he was a menace to society. Garvey, in protest, said, "I am disappointed that Your Honor has taken into consideration the remarks made by the prosecutor, for whom I have nothing but contempt." His statements are utterly false, and this trial has been a conspiracy to ruin Marcus Garvey. I am satisfied to let the world judge me innocent or guilty. History will decide. Several bomb squad men and policemen closed in on him, and he was pushed toward a freight elevator. He was conveyed in an armored car to the Tombs. Government raids were made on Liberty Hall, also the offices of the organization, but they did not find even a pistol or a cartridge. But the press did not publish the results of the raids. On June 21st, 1923, Garvey was escorted to the courtroom heavily guarded, and Judge Mack pronounced the sentence of 5 years imprisonment, $1,000 fine, and the costs of the case. Garvey's attorney gave notice of appeal. Bail was denied, and Garvey was hustled back to prison. He was kept in the Tombs for 3 months, during which time his attorney made several applications for bail. Each time, the trial judge and the district attorney refused to recommend the same. When the judge left for Europe on vacation, they were successful, but the bond was set at $15,000. The lawyer contacted the leading bond companies, but all refused when they heard the name Garvey. Some said, "Sorry, just can't touch it." One said, "Frankly, if we carried this man's bond, we would be blacklisted." The officers of the UNIA and I, Amy Jacques Garvey, had to arrange speaking tours in all the states and borrowed the bond money from the members. When the bond was posted, he was released. In 1924, Marcus Garvey had completed plans for a large settlement of Black Americans to Africa. He intended to make Liberia the African headquarters of the UNIA. The European powers who were occupying Africa brought pressure on Liberia to deny Garvey the right to start a settlement in that country. They feared that the spirit of nationalism would spread throughout Africa and put an end to colonial rule. The president of Liberia eventually reversed the decision to permit the settlement, and Garvey suffered another defeat. The party of UNIA engineers assigned to construct housing was arrested and deported the moment the ship reached Monrovia, and the police seized $50,000 worth of construction material that was used by Black settlers. Greetings, Anthony McPhail. How are you tonight? Moana Haguziki says, notice how the whole system clicked up against one man? They were practicing internal pan-Europeanism. Absolutely they were. Marcus Garvey never cried over defeats or wasted any time between them. While waiting for a hearing on the request for appeal in his case, he started another maritime venture, Black Cross Navigation and Trading Company, to replace the defunct Black Star Line. Early in 1925, Garvey's appeal came for a hearing and he was dismissed. He was sent to federal prison in Atlanta. What can be called the golden age of the Garvey movement was over, but the movement itself was not over. Now, this next reading is an article from the Century magazine written in February of 1923 by W.E.B. Du Bois. Back to Africa. It was upon the 10th of August in High Harlem of Manhattan Island, where 100,000 Negroes live. There was a long, low, unfinished church basement roofed over. A little fat Black man, ugly with intelligent eyes and a big head, was seated on a plank platform beside a quote unquote throne. Dressed in a military uniform with the gayest mid-Victorian type. heavy with the gold lace epaulettes, plume, and sword. Beside him were potentates, and before him knelt a succession of several colored gentlemen. These, in the presence of 1,000 or more applauding dark spectators, were duly knighted and raised to the peerage as knight commanders and dukes of Uganda and Niger. Among the lucky recipients of titles was the former private secretary of Booker T. Washington. So Du Bois is describing the pageantry that Garvey would often display. When he says the gayest, he means the happiest mid Victorian type of uniform. The plume and the epaulettes are those brass buckler things that you see on the shoulder pads and the that indicate rank for a military personnel. What did it all mean? A casual observer might have mistaken it for the dress rehearsal of a new comic opera and looked instinctively for Bert Williams and Miller and Lyles. But it wasn't. It was a serious occasion, done on the whole soberly and solemnly. Another might have found it simply silly. All ceremonies, more or less, are silly. Some Negroes would have said this ceremony has had something symbolic, like the coronation, because it was part of a great Back to Africa movement and represented self determination for the Negro race and a relieving of the America of her most difficult race problem by a voluntary operation. On the other hand, many American Negroes and some others were scandalized by something which they could not but regard as simply child's play. It seemed to them sinister, this enthroning of a demagogue, a blatant boaster, who with the monkey shines was deluding the people and taking their hard earned dollars. And in High Harlem, there rose an instant cry, an insistent cry: Garvey must go. Knowledge of all this seeped through to the greater world because it was sensational and made good copy for the reporters. If it bleeds, it leads. The great world now and then becomes aware of certain currents within itself, tragedies and comedies, movements of mind, gossip, personalities, and some inner whirlpool of which it had been scarcely aware before. Usually, these things are of little interest or influence for the main current of events. And yet, is not this same main current made up of the impinging of these smaller swirlings of little groups? No matter how segregated and silent the smaller whirlpool is, if it is American, at some time it strikes and influences the American world. What then is the latest news from this area of Negrodom spiritually so foreign to most of white America? The sensation that Garvey created was due not so much to his program as to his processes of reasoning, his proposed methods of work, and the width of the stage upon which he essayed to play his part. His reasoning was at first new and inexplicable to Americans because he brought to the United States a new Negro problem. We think of our problem here as the Negro problem, but we more or less clearly than the problem of the American Negro is very different from the problem of the South American, South African Negro, or the problem of the Nigerian Negro, or the problem of the South American Negro. We have not hitherto been so clear as to the way in which the problem of the Negro in the United States differs from the problem of the Negro in the West Indies. For a long time, we have been told, and we have believed, that the race problem in the West Indies, and in particular in Jamaica, has virtually been settled. Let us note the facts. Let us note the facts. Garvey was born on the northern coast of Jamaica in 1887. He was a poor black boy, his father dying later in the almshouse. Now we know that this isn't true because a man could not be educated and poor at the same time. He had private tutors, he had went to primary and secondary school, he had some college under his belt, he traveled, but this was Du Bois's perspective. He was a poor black boy, his father later dying in the almshouse or the poorhouse. He received a little training in the Church of England grammar school and then learned the trade of printing, working for years as foreman of a printing plant. Then he went to Europe and wandered about Europe and France, working and observing until he finally returned to Jamaica. He found himself facing a stone wall. He was poor, he was black, he had no chance for a university education. He had no likely chance for preferment in any line, but could work as an artisan at a small wage for the rest of his life. Moreover, he knew that the so-called settlement of the race problem in Jamaica was not complete, that as a matter of fact, throughout the West Indies, the development had been like this. Most white masters had cohabitated with Negro women, and some had actually married them. Their children were free by law in most cases, but were not recognized equals of whites in either socially, politically, or economically. Because of the numbers of the free Negroes as compared with the masters, and because of their continued growth in wealth and intelligence, they began to get political power, and they finally either expelled the whites by uniting with the blacks, as in Haiti, or forced the whites to receive the mulattoes, or at least the lighter hued ones, as equals. Moana Haguziki writes, Du Bois thought the further away you were born from the white man, the poorer you were. In his mind, he didn't go to Harvard like him. He couldn't imagine a world where the black could educate himself, where the black man could educate himself. This is the West Indian solution of the Negro problem. The mulattoes are virtually regarded and treated as whites with the assumption that they will continue white intermarriage, bleach out their color as soon as possible. This is an interesting statement coming from Du Bois, because he was a mulatto. He was mixed, but he couldn't pass. So you guys see when I say that mulattoes, when they rise the ranks, they are disgruntled people that treat black people badly because they are mad because they can't pass. But anyway, the West Indian solution of the Negro problem. The mulattoes are virtually regarded and treated as whites, with the assumption that they will, by continuous white intermarriage, bleach out their color as soon as possible. There survived, therefore, few white colonials, save newcomers who are not of Negro descent in some more or less remote ancestor. Mulattoes intermarry, then largely with the whites, and the so-called disappearance of the color line is the disappearance of the line between the whites and the mulattoes, and not between the whites and the blacks, or even between the mulattoes and the blacks. Thus, the privileged and exploiting group of the West Indies is composed of whites and mulattoes, while the poorly paid and ignorant proletariat are the blacks, forming a peasantry vastly in the majority, but socially, politically, and economically helpless and nearly voiceless. This peasantry, moreover, has been systematically deprived of its natural leadership because the black boy who showed initiative or who accidentally gained wealth and education soon gained the recognition of the white mulatto group and might be incorporated with them, particularly if he married one of them. Thus, his interests and his efforts were identified with the mulatto white group. And Garvey specifically tells us in his own words that he had an opportunity to become one of those black whites, but he chose to remain black and suffer with his people to build up the mass of people. There must naturally arise a more or less insistent demand among the black peasants for self expression and for an exposition of their grievances by one of their own group. Such leaders have indeed arisen from time to time, and Marcus Garvey was one. His notoriety comes not from his ability and accomplishment, but from the Great War. Not that he was without ability, he was a facile speaker, able to express himself in grammatical and forceful English. He had spent enough time in world cities like London to get an idea of world movements. And he honestly believed that the backwardness of the blacks was simply the result of oppression and lack of opportunity. That statement right there by Du Bois implies that at the time of this writing, he didn't believe that those were the primary reasons that Black people were so backward or had so many problems and challenges, that genuinely oppression and lack of opportunity were the only things holding the Black man back. Du Bois had some growing to do. On the other hand, Garvey had no thorough education and a very hazy idea of the technique of civilization. He fell easily onto the common error of assuming that because oppression has retarded a group, the mere removal of the injustice will at a bound restore the group to full power. Then, too, he personally had his drawbacks. He was inordinately vain and egotistic, jealous of his power, impatient of details, a poor judge of human nature, and he had the common weakness of untrained devotees that no dependence could be put upon his statements of fact. Not that he was a conscious liar, but dream, fact, fancy, wish were all so blurred in his thinking that neither he himself nor his hearers could clearly or easily extricate them. So he was saying that the lines between dream, fact, fantasy, and wish and reality were all blurred. Hmm. Then came the new economic demand for Negro peasant labor on the Panama Canal, and finally the Great War. Black West Indians began to make something like decent wages. They began to travel and they began to talk and think. Garvey talked and thought with them. In conjunction with white and colored sympathizers, he planned a small Jamaican Tuskegee. This failed, and he conceived the idea of a purely Negro organization to establish independent Negro states and link them with commerce and industry. His Universal Negro Improvement Association launched August 1st of 1914 in Jamaica was launched August 1st, 1914 in Jamaica was soon in financial difficulties. The war was beginning to change the world, and as white laborers began to be drawn into war work where there was an opening in many lines, not only for Southern American Negroes as laborers and mechanics, but also for West Indians as servants and laborers. They began to migrate in larger numbers. With this new migration came Marcus Garvey. He established a little group of his own Jamaica countrymen in Harlem and launched his program. He took no account of the American Negro problem. He knew nothing about it. What he was trying to do was to settle the Jamaican problem in the United States. On the other hand, American Negroes knew nothing about the Jamaican problem, and they were excited and indignant at being brought face to face with a man who was full of wild talk about Africa and the West Indies and steamship lines and quote unquote race pride, but who said nothing and apparently knew nothing about the right to vote, the horrors of lynching and mob law, and the problem of racial equality. Moreover, they were simply incensed at the new West Indian conception of the color line. Color lines had naturally often appeared in colored America, but the development had early on taken a far different direction from that in the West Indies. Migration by whites had numerically overwhelmed both masters and mulattoes and compelled most American masters to sell their own children into slavery. Freedom, therefore, rather than color, became the first line of social distinction in the American Negro world, despite the near white aristocracies of cities like Charleston and New Orleans. And despite the fact that the proportion of mulattoes who were free and who gained some wealth and education was greater than that of blacks because of the favor of their white parents. After emancipation, color caste tended to rise again, but the darker group was quickly welded into one despite color by caste legislation, which applied to a white man with one Negro great grandfather as well as to a full blooded Bantu. This is the one drop rule. There were still obvious advantages to the Negro American of lighter hue in passing for white or posing as Spanish or Portuguese, but the pressing demand for ability and efficiency and honesty within this fighting, advancing group continually drove the color line back before reason and necessity, and it came to be generally regarded as the poorest possible taste for a Negro to even refer to differences of color. Colored folk as white as the whitest came to describe themselves as Negroes, because we want to accept everybody. Imagine then the surprise and disgust of these Americans when Garvey launched his Jamaican color scheme. He did this, of course, ignorantly and with no idea of his mistake and no wit to read the signs. He meant well. He saw what seemed to him the same color lines which he hated in Jamaica, and he sought here, as there, to oppose white supremacy and the white ideal by a crude and equally brutal attack of black supremacy and black idea. His mistake did not lie in the utter impossibility of this program. Greater upheavals in ideal have shaken the world before, but rather in its spiritual bankruptcy and futility. For what shall this poor world gain if it exchange one race supremacy for another? I think it can gain a lot. Garvey soon sensed that somewhere he was making a mistake, and he began to protest that he was not including mulattoes from his organization. Indeed, he has men of all colors and all bloods in his organization, but his propaganda still remains all black because this brings cash from the Jamaican peasants. Once he was actually hailed to court and made to apologize for calling a disgruntled former colleague white. His tirades and twistings have landed him in strange contradictions. Thus, with one voice, he denounced Booker T. Washington and Frederick Douglass as bastards, and with the same, and in the next, he named his boarding house and his first steamship after these same men. Aside from his color lines, Garvey soon developed in America a definite and in many respects original and alluring program. He proposed to establish the Black Star Line of steamships under Negro ownership and with Negro money to trade between the United States, the West Indies, and Africa. He proposed to establish a corporation which was going to build factories and manufacture goods, both for local consumption of Negroes and for export. He was going to eventually take possession of Africa and establish independent Negro governments there. The statement of this program, with tremendous headlines, wild eloquence, and great insistence and repetition, caught the attention of all America, black and white. When Mr. Garvey brought his cohorts to Madison Square Garden, clad in fancy costumes and with new songs and ceremonies, and when ducking his dark head at the audience, he yelled, "We are going to Africa to tell England, France, and Belgium to get out of there." America sat up, listened, laughed, and said, "Here at least is something new." Negroes, especially West Indians, flocked to his movement and poured money into it. About 3 years ago, he had some 80,000 members in his organization, and perhaps 20 or 30,000 were paying regularly 35 cents a month into his chest. These numbers grew in his imagination until he was claiming 4.5 million followers and speaking for 400 million Negroes. He did not, however, stop with dreams and promises. If he had been simply a calculating scoundrel, he would have carefully skirted the narrow line between promise and performance and avoided as long as possible the inevitable catastrophe. But he believed in his program, and he had a childish ignorance of the stern facts of the world into whose face he was flying. Being an islander and born in a little realm where half a day's journey takes one from ocean to ocean, the world always seemed small to him. And it was perhaps perhaps it was excusable for his black peasant of Jamaica to think of Africa as a similar but slightly larger island which could easily be taken possession of. His first practical step was to establish the Black Star Line, and here he literally left his critics and opponents breathless by suddenly announcing in 1919 that the Frederick Douglass, a steamship, had been brought by his line, was on exhibition at a wharf in New York, and was about to set sail to the West Indies with a freight of passengers. This announcement was electrical even for those who did not believe in Garvey. With a splendid, audacious faith, this poor black leader, one moment, with a splendid, audacious faith, this poor black leader, with his storming tongue, compelled a word of admiration from all, but the seeds of failure were in his first were in his very first efforts. This first boat, the Yarmouth, never renamed the Frederick Douglass, probably because of financial difficulties, was built in the year that Marcus Garvey was born and was an old sea-scarred hulk. He was cheated in buying it and paid $140,000 for it, at least twice as much as the boat was worth. She made 3 trips to the West Indies in 3 years and then was docked for repairs, attached for debt, and finally in December of 1921 sold at auction for $1,625. The second boat that Garvey bought was a steam yacht originally built for a Standard Oil magnate. It too was old and of doubtful value. But Garvey paid $60,000 for it and sent it down to do a small carrying trade between the West Indian islands. The boat broke down and it cost $70,000 or $80,000 more to repair it than Garvey paid for it. Finally, it was wrecked or seized in Cuba and the crew was transported to the United States at government expense. The third boat was a Hudson River ferry boat that Garvey bought for $35,000. With this, he carried excursionists up and down the Hudson during one summer and used it as a vivid advertisement to collect more money. The boat, however, ran only that summer, then had to be abandoned as beyond repair. Finally, Garvey tried to buy from the United States Shipping Board the steamship Orion, for $250,000. This boat was to be renamed the Phyllis Wheatley, and its sailings were advertised in Garvey's weekly paper for several months, and some passages were sold, but the boat was never delivered because sufficient payments were not made. Thus, the Black Star Line arose and disappeared, and with it went some $800,000 of the savings of West Indians and a few American Negroes. With this enterprise, the initial step and greatest test of Mr. Garvey's movement failed utterly. His Factories Corporation never really got started. In its place, he has established a number of local grocery stores in Harlem and 1 or 2 shops, including a laundry and a printing press, which may or may not survive. Bwana Haguziki says his so-called ignorance of being an islander was his greatest strength because he saw men, and he was right. What one man can accomplish, others could too, regardless of going to Harvard. That's what Bwana Haguziki thinks of Marcus Garvey. An African program was made impossible by his own pig-headedness. He proposed to make a start in Liberia with industrial enterprise. From this center, he would penetrate all Africa and gradually subdue it. Instead of keeping this plan hidden and working cautiously and intelligently toward it, he yelled and shouted and telegraphed it all over the world without consulting the Liberians. He apparently was ready to assume partial charge of their state. He appointed officials with high-sounding titles and announced that the headquarters of his organization was to be removed to Liberia in January of 1922. Such announcements, together with talk about conquest and driving Europe out, aroused European governments to inquire about Garvey and his backing. Diplomatic representations were made to Liberia, asking how far it had intended to cooperate in his program. Liberia was naturally compelled to repudiate Garveyism, root and branch. The officials told Garvey that he or anyone else was welcome to migrate to Liberia and develop industry within legal lines, but that they could recognize only one authority in Liberia, and that was the authority of the Liberian government, and that Liberia could not be the seat of any intrigue against her peaceful neighbors. They made it impossible for Garvey to establish any headquarters in Africa unless it was done by the consent of the very nations whom he was threatening to drive out of Africa. This ended his African program and reduced him to the curious alternative of sending a delegation to the Third Assembly of the League of Nations to ask them to hand over as a gift to his organization a German colony in order that he might begin his work. Thus, the bubble of Garveyism burst. But its significance, its meaning remains. After all, one has to get within Garvey to know him, to understand him. He was not simply a liar and blatant fool. Something of both, to be sure, is there. But that is not all. He is the type of dark man whom the white world is making daily, molding, marring, tossing to the air. All his life, whites have laughed and sneered at him and torn his soul. All his life, he was hated, and he has hated the half whites, who, rejecting their darker blood, have gloried in their pale sham. He stormed and fought within, and then at last it all burst out. He had to guard himself before the powers and be careful of law and libel and hunger. But where he could be free, he snarled and cursed the whites, insulted the mulattoes with unpardonable epithets, and bitterly reviled the blacks for their cowardice. Suppose now for a moment that Garvey had been a man of first-rate ability, canny, shrewd, patient, dogged. He might have brought a world war of races a generation nearer. He might have deprived civilization of that precious generation of respite where we have yet time to sit and consider if difference of human color is most necessarily means blows and bloods. As a matter of fact, Garvey did not know how to approach his self-appointed task. He had not the genius to wait and laboriously learn, yet he pompously seized the pose. He kept extremely busy, rushed hither and thither, and collected and squandered thousands, almost millions. Almost millions. He must succeed. He appeared in the uniforms of his dream triumphs in 1921 with an academic cap and gown, weird in colors. In 1922, with cocked hat, gold lace, and sword, the commander-in-chief of the African Legion. He did not quite dare call himself King Marcus I, but he sunned himself a while in the address of Your Majesty. He held court and made knights, lords, and dukes, and yet he feverishly worked. He knew he had failed. He knew he had missed the key to some dark arcanum. He grew suspicious, morose, complaining, furious at the fools and scoundrels who were plotting his ruin to overthrow his cause and to overthrow his cause. With all the provincial backwoods love of courts and judges, he rushed into and reveled in litigation, figuring in at least 50 suits, suing for libel, breach of contract, slander, divorce, assault, anything and everything, while in turn his personal enemies sued him, rioted against him, and one of them even shot him. And so today, and so that today he dares not stir without a sturdy bodyguard. Beaten and overwhelmed with loss and disappointment, he will not yet surrender and seeks by surrounding himself with new officials and by announcing new enterprises, a daily paper, a new line of steamships, and the like, to reform his lines. So he sits today. He is a world figure in a minute microcosm on a larger field with fair opportunity. He might have been great, certainly notorious. He is today a little puppet, serio comic, funny yet swept with a great veil of tragedy, meaning in himself little more than a passing agitation, moving darkly and uncertainly from a little island in the sea to the painting half submerged millions of the first world state. And yet he means something to the world. He is type of a mighty coming thing. He voices a vague, formless, but growing, integrating human mind, which some say, which someday will arrest the world. Just what it has cost the Negro race in money to support Garvey, it is hard to say, but certainly not less than $1 million. And yet, with all this, there are certain peculiar satisfactions. Here has come a test to the American Negro which he has not had before. A demagogue has appeared, not the worst kind of demagogue, but on the contrary, a man who had much which was attractive and understandable in his personality and his program. Nevertheless, a man whose program anybody with common sense knew was impossible. With all the arts of the demagogue, Garvey appealed to crowds of people with persuasive eloquence, with the ringing of a possible charge of all possible charges of race loyalty and the bastardy of the mulatto and the persons ashamed of their race, and the implacable enmity of the whites. It was the sort of appeal that easily throws ignorant and inexperienced people into orgies of response and generosity. Yet, with all this coming at a critical time when the Negro was hurt at his war experience and his post war treatment, when lynching was still a national institution and mob law a ready resort, when the rank and file of ignorant West Indian Negroes were going wild over Garvey, the American Negroes sat cool and calm and were neither betrayed into wild and unjust attacks upon Garvey nor into uncritical acceptance. His following had ebbed and flowed, and its main moving nucleus had been a knot of Black Jamaica peasants residing in America as laborers and servants, mostly unlettered, poor, and ignorant, who worshiped Garvey as their ideal incarnate. Garvey is bold. Garvey lashes the white folks. Garvey downs the mulattoes. Garvey forever, no matter what he does. Does he steal? Better let him steal. Better him than to let the white folks steal. Does he squander? It's our money. Let him waste it. Does he fail? Others have failed. It is this blind and dangerous nucleus that explains Garvey's success in holding his power. Around these are a mass of West Indians resident in the islands and in the United States who have honestly supported Garvey in the hope that this new leader would direct them out of the West Indian impasse of low wages, little educational opportunity, no industrial openings, and yes, caste. Especially they seized upon the Black Star Line as isolated islanders would as a plan of real practical hope. This group reached 60 or 70,000 in number during Garvey's heyday, but with the failure of his enterprises, it is rapidly falling away. With these groups have always been a number of American Negroes, the ignorant drawn by eloquence and sound, the grafters or grifters who saw a chance in sharing the spoils, and with these, some honest thinking folk who paused and inquired, who is Garvey and what is his program? This American following, though always small, grew here and there. and in centers like Norfolk, Chicago, and Pittsburgh reached for a time into the thousands. But on the whole, American Negroes stood the test well. Garvey's proposal of such new autonomous and hostile black world in league with the brown and yellow peoples brought from American Negroes a simple Missouri. Show us, they asked. They asked, what are you going to do and how? What are your concrete and practical proposals? They did not follow the more impatient counsels of Garvey must go. They did not slander or silence or ignore him. The 200 Negro weeklies treated him fairly, and audiences listened to his words and read his literature. And right here lay his undoing. For the more his flamboyant promises were carefully compared with his results, the sooner the utter futility of his program was revealed. Here is a world that for 1,000 years, from the First Crusade to the Great War, has been breaking down barriers between nations and races in order to build a worldwide economic unity and cultural solidarity. This is that one people thing. The process has involved slavery, peonage, rape, theft, and extermination, but it is slowly uniting humanity. It is now proposed to turn back and cut out of this world its black eighth or its colored two-thirds. Not only is this virtually impossible, but its attempt today would certainly involve the white and colored worlds in a death struggle whose name none can surely foretell. The power of yellow, black, and brown worlds today is the economic dependence of the white world on them. And the power of the white world is its economic, technique, and organization. The super diplomacy of race politics tomorrow is to transmute its interdependence into cultural sympathy, spiritual tolerance, and human freedom. Not in segregation, but in closer, larger unity lies interracial peace. Not with the entire clearness, and yet with a certain fundamental and tremendously significant clarity, the American Negro realizes this, and as yet no demagoguery or pipe dreams have been able to divorce him from the facts. The present generation of Negroes has survived two grave temptations. The greater one, fathered by Booker T. Washington, which said, let politics alone, keep in your place, work hard, and do not complain, and which meant perpetual color cast for color folks by their own cooperation and consent, and the consent inevitable debauchery of the white world, and the lesser fathered by Marcus Garvey, which said, give up, surrender, the struggle is useless, back to Africa and fight the white world. It is no ordinary tribute to American Negro poise and common sense and ability to choose and reject leadership that neither of these programs has been able to hold them. One of the most singular proofs of this is the latest support of Garveyism is the notorious Ku Klux Klan. When Garvey saw his Black Star Line disappear, his West Indian membership fall off, and his American listeners grow increasingly critical, he flew south to consult the Grand Cyclops of the Invisible Empire. Whether the initiative came from him or from the Klan is not known, but probably the Klan invited him. They were indeed birds of a feather, believing in titles, flummery, and mumbo jumbo, and handling with much gullible money. Garvey's motives were clear. The triumph of the Klan would drive Negroes to his program in despair, while the Klan's sympathy would enable him to enter the South, where he has not dared to work and exploit the ignorant black millions. The Klan's object was to encourage anything that would induce Negroes to believe that their fight for freedom in America was vain. Garvey's secretary said that the Klan would probably finance the Black Star Line, and Garvey invited the Grand Cyclops to speak at his convention. But Garvey reckoned without his host. A storm of criticism arose among Negroes and kept Garvey explaining, contradicting, and repudiating the unholy alliance, and finally drove it undercover. Although Garvey openly advertised the Klan's program as showing the impossibility of the Negroes remaining in America, and the Klan sent out circulars defending Garvey and declaring that the opposition to him was from the Catholic Church. Again, it is High Harlem, with its music and laughter, its conversations aloft, its teeming, bantering, pushing crowds, its brown and black and cream-like faces, its crisp and curling hair. As the setting sun sends its last crimson light from the heights that hold the Hudson from Harlem, it floods 138th Streets and lights 3 blocks. One is a block of homes built by the Equitable Life Insurance Society, but now sold to Negroes, some crowded, some carelessly kept, but most of them beautiful, even luxurious, so perhaps as handsome a block as middle class America, black or white, affords. Next, the sun softens the newness of the brick block on 7th Avenue, stretching low and beautiful from the YWCA, with a moving picture house of the better class and a colored five and dime store, built and owned by black folk. Down beyond 138th Street, the sun burns the raising spire of the Abyssinian Church, a vast and striking structure built by Negroes who for 100 years have supported one organization and are now moving to their newest and luxurious home of soft carpets, strained windows, and swelling organ. Finally, the dying rays hit a low, rambling basement of brick and rough stone. It was designed as the beginning of a church long ago, but abandoned. Marcus Garvey roofed it over and put this squat and dirty old Liberty Hall. He screams propaganda. As compared with homes and businesses, the church, Garvey's basement represents nothing in accomplishment and only waste in attempt. Yet it has a right to be. It represents something spiritual, however poor and futile today. Deep in the black man's heart, he knows that he needs more than homes and stores and churches. He needs manhood, liberty, brotherhood, equality. The call of the Spirit urges him restlessly to and fro with all men of the despised and forgotten, seeking. Misled they often are, and again they play in microcosm the same tragic drama that other worlds and other groups have played. Here is Garvey yelling to life from the black side, a race consciousness which leaps to meet Madison Grant and Lothrop Stoddard and other worshippers of the great white race. It is symptomatic and portentous. If with a greater and more gifted and efficient Garvey, it sometime blazes to real flame. It means world war and eternal hate and blood. It means the setting of the world clock back 1,000 years. And yet the world's Garveys are not solely to blame, but rather every worshiper of race superiority and human inequality. On the other hand, back of all this lurks the quieter, more successful, more insistent and hopeful fact Races are living together. They are buying and selling, marrying and rearing children, laughing and crying. They are fighting mobs and lynchers and those that enslave and despise, and they have not yet failed in that fight. Their faith in their ultimate and complete triumph are these homes, this business block, this church duplicated 100,000 times in a nation of 12 million. Here, then, are the two future paths outlined with a certain sullen dimness in the world's blood crimson twilight, and yet to be described easily by those with the seeing hearts. Which path will America choose? And I'm sorry, I try to keep you all for an hour every day, but it was an hour and a half today. Du Bois was loquacious and somewhat eloquent of Garvey. I feel like he is on this people of color thing because he was a person of color. His existence was more of a contradiction than a black man's existence was a contradiction. He felt as though we should all try to get along and that a race war would lead to a bloody end. He felt that we should go after our political rights by trying to get along with these people and living beside them, or at least those were his thoughts at this time. So, tomorrow we will be reading Garvey and Garveyism by A.F. Elms. I thank each and every one of you for tuning in. I want to say thank you to Bawana Haguziki, Anthony McPhail, Sister Raw, the Pro Black Perspective, the Forecast, Koku, and Brother Bakari. I want to say thank you all for supporting the work that I do. I want to let you know that I especially appreciate you, Sister Raw, Bwana Haguziki, Afro Native, Forecast, and Derico Cooper, and Brother Bakari. I will see you all tomorrow night at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, where we're going to read Garvey and Garveyism, an estimate by A.F. Elms. Peace, guys.